last week we ended with a passage about the weeds and the wheat.
Yeah.
And Jesus was giving a parable about the kingdom, what the kingdom of God is like. And at the end, he says, and the wheat or the weeds will be gathered up in bundles and then burned. So that left us to the next question of what does that mean? And basically I think most of our modern minds go to hell. That's what we're talking about.
Right.
So I'm going to kind of let you take the lead on this one, Chris.
Sure.
So what do you got for us here?
Yeah, so for a very long time, I don't know how long, the debate has always been what exactly is hell?
Mm-hmm.
Is it something where there is an eternal punishment? Is it something where you're punished for a short amount of time and then you just cease to exist? Like judgment still takes place, but then you're just gone.
Mm-hmm.
Or is hell just another word for complete destruction? Like some annihilationists will say that you just die, but actually most will say that you are punished, and then after a period of time, depending on what you've done, you just cease to exist. So, I mean, for most of my life growing up, I never heard the annihilationist point of view. I think a lot of Christians, you just hear that you're going to be punished for eternity, you're going to go into hell, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, it'll be terrible, and that'll be your eternity. And kind of when I was getting ready to go to seminary, I had a lot of friends that we would discuss this stuff through, and one of my friends was a huge proponent of annihilationism. He just couldn't get around the fact that if God is supposed to be all-loving, why would there be eternal punishment? Eternal punishment doesn't make sense for temporary sin, right? I would say the stuff you do on earth, it ends when you die. So why would you be punished for eternity for that? And lots of good points. There is a lot of scriptural evidence for it, but it's just something I never heard.
Yeah.
And so that began to get me thinking a lot about that point of view and how I could see why it's an attractive point of view.
Yeah, just like there are many paradigms of what it means to be saved, what it means to have salvation, there are many paradigms of what it means for the opposite.
Right.
Damned.
And I think it's worth noting a few things up top. That one, the majority of the Bible is not a narrative about are you going to heaven or hell. Most of what Jesus talks about is not are you going to heaven or hell. It's what are you doing right here, right now. And I think the majority of the Bible is tracking with that. So I just think that's worth saying. Is like, it's good and it's fun to have these conversations. But it seems from the narrative of the Bible that this isn't the main thing.
Yeah.
I just think that's worth throwing out.
Basic instructions before leaving Earth, not after.
Yeah. I totally agree. I think most theology is kind of a moot point. Like the really important thing is faith in Jesus and like how you live your life on earth.
Yep.
So I totally agree.
Yeah. And the other thing I think is worth pointing out, Genesis 1 starts with, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And not God created heaven and hell, or heaven, earth, and hell. I just think it's worth noting, just to kind of further emphasize the point that like the narrative is about the heaven, like God space and human space colliding. It's not about like this choice that you're either going to go spend eternity one place or another. I just think that's really worth stating before.
I agree. I think this is more important to talk about through the tradition and the history of the church.
Yeah.
Because the tradition and the history of the church focuses on hell a lot.
It does. Yeah.
That's how a lot of people have chosen to get people to believe in Jesus is the consequence of if you don't.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one reason the church has decided to side with eternal conscious torment, but another reason is because it's a typical Hellenistic view for the soul to always be eternal.
Yeah, that's
like
true.
No matter what. And so that's a really interesting point of view. Like the early church was kind of formed around these Hellenistic points of view. And like everything was influenced by the soul and the forms.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense to have that kind of coincide with.
Yeah, and that's all a product of the social way of things when the early church was formed. They were living in Roman society that ascribed to like the Hellenistic view of
Western
things.
philosophy started there.
And you know, there could be an argument to say, well, Jesus chose to reveal himself at this time for a reason, for sure. You know, so I'm not saying we should throw that out.
Well, no, and it makes sense. Like in the when you look at like Christianity and you look at like the teachings of Plato and Aristotle, like
they line up pretty exactly.
It's awesome. It's actually really cool.
Yeah,
and it gives us a lot of words to talk about what we want to talk about.
Yep.
But I think we should also be careful that we don't just agree with whatever they taught too.
Yeah.
Well, it is something I think about all the time. Like, it's too bad that, like, the semantics of what the Bible doesn't specify or, like, purposely tries to be vague about is what, like, consumes American Christians' mind in 2019.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And there's really no pictures in the Bible, or no times in the Bible where God or Jesus says this is a literal view of what's going to happen.
It's always metaphorical, comparative,
or apocalyptic kind of literature.
You know what's interesting about that too is that plays into annihilationism a lot, but also eternal conscious torment, because some people would even say that a lot of the way they talk about hell isn't even literal.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe hell is a terrible place, but maybe it's not constant agony, like physically.
Well, maybe it's not even a place, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a state of mind. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's just, but it could be a lot of different things. And they would even say that you don't have to completely describe to it literally being a burning or a burning pit of fire to say that it's eternal conscious torment.
Yeah. Well, and it's good that you brought up the Old Testament too, because like in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and like every single time that hell, in like a lot of different translations, is mentioned, it's mentioned in conjunction with the word grave or death. It's not.
The Old Testament.
Yeah, it's to represent dying, and how that is juxtaposed against living, as opposed to being like and it's used.
Sheol.
Yes, it's used literally as grave, and then it's also used as like that kind of metaphorical mind state. You know, maybe a place, but it's never like, I don't know where we got like the fiery pit of hell and stuff like
New
that.
Testament mostly.
Yeah, I think Jesus
says things with fire quite a bit, and then Revelation would be the other place where fire and sulfur and lakes of fire show up.
Well, and also, but you've talked about like the positive side of the metaphor to fire before, where it's like a lot of times in the New Testament they talk about burning and then what's left over,
like the refining.
Yeah, a refining process. So I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah.
Where are we going next?
Man, well, I mean, what do you guys think? Yeah. I've already kind of expressed like what I've thought being brought up. I've never even heard the fact that there's a possibility that people might just be annihilated, which makes sense. You don't want to go teach a congregation two different things that could, you know, if somebody's brand new to their faith, completely mess up everything they've been taught so far.
Yeah.
So this is kind of a tricky subject.
It is.
But what do you guys think about these?
Yeah, well, I think that's interesting too, because probably the reason pastors are so wary of even saying, well, there could be a few different points of view, is because for a lot of people's paradigms, it was an integral reason to why they choose to believe in Jesus. They're like, well, I don't want to go to hell, so I want to believe in Jesus. And like for me, like growing up, that was kind of like your main motivation to be evangelizing. Is like, hey, you don't want your friends to go to hell, do you? Like, you don't want them to be tortured forever in eternal punishment,
I remember having a conversation with a girl in high school where she was like, "Are you a believer?" And I was like, "Nah." And she was like, and I was like, "Am I going to hell?" And she was like, "Yes." And I was like, "All right." You know, like now, like to totally like turn me off the entire thing.
I get what you're saying. That is a terrible way to share the gospel. I hate that. And like
I pinned her into that. She was a very nice girl.
Yeah. But still, I mean but that's what she was taught. Like I was taught the same thing when I was in youth group.
And so was I. Yeah.
It's like, do you want your friends to be in agony forever? Like, no, I don't. So like, share Jesus with them. It's not like, do you want your friends to know Jesus? So they have a better life. Which should be the gospel.
Yeah, well, I think it is. Sometimes it's half and half. Like, I don't want to go to hell, and I really do want to go to heaven. But like I feel like those are in constant. It's not a pure 50-50. I don't even think it should be a 50-50.
Yeah.
Like it's a constant like, man, I feel like I'm gonna go to hell today. And it's like, man, I would really like to see some people in heaven and like experience that with God, you know.
Yeah. And I think it's worth saying too that the parable that got us onto this subject, the meat of that parable is Jesus saying like, don't be those people.
Not for you, yeah.
The context is him calling out the Pharisees to be like, you're a bunch of hypocrites who say like you're going to heaven, essentially you're going to heaven, everyone else is going to hell unless they can live up to your standards.
Right.
But the reality is like you don't live up to your standards, and like you don't even know you like it's not your job. When the workers are like, hey, should we go pull up the weeds? He's like, no, not your job.
Right.
And so I think that's another good thing to say as we're here is like we're not here to tell anyone what's happening to them.
I think it's just it's an interesting thing to talk about because the Bible is not clear about it.
Mm-hmm.
We know it's their fire is talked about a lot, which can either be destruction or pain.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the Bible isn't clear about it, and that I think it can dramatically influence the way we view God.
Yeah, I think it really does. And that's why it is still really important to talk about, I think, and worth talking about.
Well, and to answer your question, like, what do I think of hell? I think for a long time I was like, the idea of hell is stupid. Like, I can't rectify that with, and even when I was, like, an unbeliever, like, I can't rectify that with life. I can't rectify that with, like, the Creator. I can't rectify that with the God is love. Idea that's like purported in the Bible very heavily. But then I heard probably like within the last year, Tim from the Bible Project talking about how like if we actually have free will, it's not free will if we don't have consequences for our actions.
Sure.
So like whether that plays into eternal condemnation or like temporary condemnation, like there is, and that really resonated with me. Where it's like that once again is like that I want to go to hell. Like I should probably be a good person because my actions in this life have a very important result of how I spend my afterlife.
Sure. Yeah.
So
yeah, I think consequences from actions, and then the other side of that is that a God who forces everyone to be reconciled to Him is that loving for Him to do. Would be to say like, okay, you spent your whole life running from me, you spent your whole life choosing not to exist in my kingdom, I'm going to force you to exist in my kingdom. Like for someone who has spent their whole life and all of their being not wanting to be a part of that, is that a loving decision from God? And you could say and I think if people could argue like yes, it would still be
that would
loving.
be like the parent-kid relationship where you know better than your kid, so even though they've screwed up, you're just gonna do the right thing for them. But that's not the relationship we have with God.
But here's the thing though,
you become an adult.
It's not even do the right thing for them. So like what if like Roma has a tantrum and then I'm like, here's a sucker, like stop having that tantrum.
The problem is that it's eternal. Right? That she doesn't have an opportunity to understand what you're doing.
Well, and that's the other thing, man. So like here we've almost taken the two views and put them into three boxes.
I think there's three.
Yeah, where it's like an annihilationism, which like I have a problem with too. Like how does the soul get snuffed out? We've been talking about the soul in church and how it's eternal and how it exists outside of your body. Like does God have the ability to just be like? Psst,
well, they would say most I think scholars would say that it's not that it gets snuffed out, but that God the idea of an eternal soul, like that gift, is something that God gives to Christians. It's
so
not
he assimilates it back into himself.
It's not like he takes it away from somebody. It's just that if you believe in Him and you have a relationship with Him, that He gives you that eternal life, and that somebody that doesn't have that never gets that eternal life.
Well,
which is, I know, it is tricky.
Yeah,
still.
That's intense.
Yeah. Well, and then box number 2. There is condemnation. There is the sentence of hell.
Right.
Jesus' words, not mine. But it's temporary.
Right.
There's a point where you can get out of hell.
You pay your due, and then you're done.
Yeah.
You're annihilated.
Yeah. Or eternal, which is also called out eternal damnation.
Yeah.
That's not a concept I don't think we came up with on our own. That's biblical.
Let me ask this question. If there is this realm of people at the end of time that is still existing, that still opposes God, there's demons or whatever exists in this realm of hell,
Mm-hmm.
and they're still existing for eternity, has God sufficiently defeated evil if that evil still exists? Has God wiped away all the tears and there is no more sorrow if hell still exists?
Well, I don't know. I think God can't be around evil. That is explicit in the Bible.
Right.
So like, I want to say yes when I think about that. Like, if he can't have it around him and it exists, true triumph would be banishment of it. But then again, it's like, is that true ultimate power if he can't just make it go away?
Right. I mean, the Revelation makes a lot of claims on both sides, but one thing it does say is that, and you'll hear this a lot, like Scott, every time there's a funeral or anything, like, talks about how there will be a time where there is no more tears and no more
every
sorrow.
tear will be wiped away, yeah.
Right. But how do you contrast that with the eternity of weeping and gnashing of teeth? Like, is it finally over if hell still exists and there's still a group of people and beings that oppose him?
Well, in Revelation 2, Jesus defeats Satan, literally.
Yeah.
And that's me oversimplifying a very, very, like, heavily metaphorical book. But, like, that does happen.
Yeah.
So...
I just thought that was interesting. I never really thought about that.
It's a really intense question.
Like, what is God's victory on both sides?
Yeah.
If he just annihilates everything, it's very clear to humans, at least. Okay, they're gone. They cease to exist. Obviously, the only thing that's left is God and his people. Mm-hmm. And if he allows heaven to exist, or hell to exist for eternity, like, then there's just this. There's always going to be this opposition to him. Like, not really in opposition to God, because God is all-powerful. It can't do anything to him, but it still exists.
And so there is the opposition of, like, Satan. But then, like, that makes me think about, like, is Hitler going to be in heaven? Like, and he's just going to be cleansed of his evil or whatever?
No, I don't think so. I think either he's in hell for eternity or he's annihilated.
Man. I don't know.
Well,
is it true... Is it true victory for God to just annihilate someone who's bad, or to take that poor example of a human and turn them into Elohim?
Well, I think that's kind of the point of the salvation story that we were talking about last week, is that the opportunity exists. Like, Jesus in himself has conquered the consequences of sin, in that he can take someone who has chosen sin and give them an avenue to conquer it through life.
And if sin is sin is sin is sin, who is Hitler compared to me?
Well, agreed. I think most people would agree with you, and so we're not putting that.
I don't agree with me.
Well, we're not putting that on a scale of like Hitler is way up here.
A 10 out of 10 of evil.
Yeah, and like white lie is way down here.
Doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. But what we're saying is, if Hitler, like, after he did all that stuff, which it seems historically this did not happen, but like if Hitler, after he did all this stuff, has like a faith moment where he's like, what I'm doing is wrong, like I believe the kingdom of Jesus is the kingdom I should be following, and like I'm going to flip my life around to be totally invested in loving God and loving others, that's a different conversation.
Well, and that also brings up the concept of Judgment Day, whether that is pre-death or post-death. It's also talked about a lot of times in the Bible, like in Revelation, he's going to open up the book, and all your good deeds and bad deeds are going to be there, and then that's going to be your judgment. So,
yeah, I mean, I think like Hayden said though, I don't think there's any sin that Christ can't atone for or hasn't atoned for. So if Hitler at the end of his life was like, I'm sorry, I recognize everything I did was wrong, I want to live for you, and then died right away, I think his sins would still be atoned for. If that was true. Like, if his heart was truly reconciled. But if he didn't do that, I think then there's the debate of, okay, this is so weird to talk about, but is he going to be punished eternally, or is he going to be punished due to what he's done and then annihilated, or is he just cease to exist? Like, we don't know, but that's kind of what we're talking about. I think Hitler next to any other sinner is kind of the same conversation, though.
Yeah, like me then. Like that's what I think about too. I jump from Hitler to like, okay, what is it?
Before you're a Christian?
But after too, I'm a very poor Christian. Like I still do bad things.
Oh,
but
I mean, Christ is Christ has done it.
Okay.
Like it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're veering back into our
The
last
salvation.
conversation.
We are, yeah.
And that's okay.
And we
Yeah,
didn't really like approach a definition of that, but one thing we did concretely say was that, like, okay, my gold stars and demerits, like, Christ wipes that side clean.
So I mean, I don't think it's bad to go back and talk about that because they are so juxtaposed in our minds.
Yes.
And the reason that is because they're so juxtaposed in Scripture. So I think it's hard to separate the two.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I can get on board with either, and a lot of the times I disagree with myself in what I believe, but I can understand eternal consequences for, like, a choice, which is what we're saying would be salvation, right? If you choose to accept Christ, you have an eternal consequence of immortality, living with Christ, whatever point of view you want to look for it. And if you move away from Christ, if you reject Him, then you have an eternal consequence as well. So I get how that can be either or. But I also see the annihilation point of view where it just seems, I don't know, it seems more loving to just cause things to cease to exist than to have them be punished for eternity.
It does.
And like that's like the root of it. And it's heresy to say that God's not loving either way. And I'm not saying that. I'm saying if eternal conscious torment does exist, if people are tortured for hell or for eternity in hell, then there's just a realm of love that I don't understand. But if God does annihilate people, then I get it. It's like they paid their sin, whatever that is, and then they're gone. Like they just don't exist. And the consequence for their action is that they don't have an eternity with God, which is a huge consequence. Like it's not that they're not being punished, it's that they're not with God. Like that's the most important part.
And I think, I also think to myself, like, when I think of consequence, I think of, like, pushing a very large rock up of an eternally uphill mountain or something like that.
Yeah.
I think of, like, getting strapped to something and stretched or something like that. But, like, we have no concept. I don't even think the Bible is clear. It uses the metaphor of fire. But, like, I don't think the Bible is clear at all about, like, what that consequence is. So, like, if the consequence is just being separated from God.
Right. That's what C.S. Lewis would say, too.
Yeah.
He believes in, or he did believe in eternal conscious torment, and that's what he talked about in his book, The Great Divorce. And it's not that, you're necessarily, like being torn apart or whatever, but you're continuing to choose to be away from God. So you're away from everything that is God, which is everything good and perfect.
Yeah, I think that corresponds with the theological claims made in Dante's Inferno and the Divine Comedy.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, there's a lot of debate on whether he was trying to make theological claims about the afterlife, but I think it's worth saying, like, Dante's picture of both hell, purgatory, and heaven, which we're not going to get into purgatory today, but they're all basically rings that you exist within a ring based on your life,
right?
So if you were just a person who you didn't choose Jesus, you didn't choose to have faith in His kingdom of self-sacrifice, but you were kind of just like a white liar. Like you did your own thing, but you never did like some serious evil. You never committed yourself to that. Then you exist in like this first ring of hell where you just kind of like continue into that plane, and it's just this place where people are just like wandering aimlessly. They have no real purpose.
Yeah.
But then, like, let's say your whole life, like you've given yourself over to lust, and like I'm just gonna pursue the passion of lust like my whole life. That you just continue into that trajectory into hell, and there's this picture of like two lovers that are just like chasing each other for eternity, and like that's what they do, and like what Dante is saying is like that's what they're doing now. Like they're just chasing. They spend their whole life just chasing after love and lust, and like this human thing.
Just an accentuation of how you.
Yeah. So hell is just God giving them over, saying like that's what you chose in this life. You'll continue to do that, and you'll kind of that idea. And then if there's more chaos, like you just continue on the trajectory. So I think it's the eternal conscious torture, but in a way that is not necessarily like if you are not putting your faith in Jesus, you go to sulfur and brimstone, and you're like you're
Right.
being ripped apart. It just
Right.
furthers the analogy of what you're saying.
Yeah, and I totally, I agree with that. I think it makes sense. I mean, it's hard to say that's what I believe because I don't know what I believe.
Mhm.
And I agree with what we said at the beginning. It doesn't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think what matters as Christians is telling people about Jesus, not what happens if they don't have Jesus.
Yeah.
Because they already know that.
Yeah.
They're living it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just, man, it's just so interesting to think about consequence. And I think a lot of people are really interested in it because, like, some people, that's why they convert to Christianity. And I think that's just sad.
Yeah.
Like, I almost like the message of annihilationism more because it forces people to look at the benefits of Christianity over, like, the consequences
The
of...
fear of what happens
Yeah.
if they don't. Yeah.
Yeah.
If God is a loving God, he probably doesn't coerce people into believing in him through fear.
Right. There doesn't need to be that fear.
Right.
Like, loving God is its own benefit. You know, it doesn't... And not having God is its own consequence.
I agree with that, and I think though that mentality gives the kind of Dante's picture even more credibility and like
Yeah.
worth, because what you're saying in that picture is like, hey, what you're pursuing in your life right now,
Mm-hmm.
like it is futile, and like
Mhm.
it is what you're pursuing. If you're pursuing like a life of lust,
Right.
like that is not, in the grand scheme of things, it's not worth what you're spending your whole life over. Like there's this whole other picture of love that is so much more grand.
Mhm.
And like if you just continue on this trajectory of chasing after this selfish feeling, like that's going to consume your whole right now
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
And then it's going to continue to consume you forever. I think that's a lot more compelling because
Yeah.
it meets people where they are now, saying like, oh man, like I have been pursuing my whole life after this like fleeting feeling, and I'm chasing it and I'm never going to attain it.
Yeah.
And so I think that to me seems more compelling as like a picture of the gospel than like a, hey, you need to choose to put your faith in Jesus so that at the day of judgment, like
You're gonna go up
you're gonna
and
go
not
up
down.
instead of down, because then that leads to what I think a lot of people's Christian paradigm is now,
Mhm.
is that like I can do whatever I want, but as long as I have faith in Jesus, I'm going up.
God, I hate that so much. And I feel like that has been the church's mantra for a while,
Yeah.
like especially in the 80s and the 90s, and I know today too, but maybe not as much. Like there's a much more movement of God is love, which has its positives and some negatives to it as well. But I think, gosh, if you live your whole life and you become a Christian at the very end, it is a good thing because you will be with God, but you've missed out on a whole life of living with God.
Yeah, I think we've identified too, like what our biggest problem is of the concept of hell, and that its use as a systemic tool to freak people out
Yeah.
is something that we're really, I think we can all agree,
Yeah.
we dislike.
It sucks.
Yeah.
It almost diminishes God.
Yes.
Because it's saying you should become a Christian because of hell, not because of who God is.
Yes. Yeah.
And that drives me crazy.
Yeah, and I think it puts more focus on like the here and now
Mhm.
instead of like, okay, what's going to happen to me after I die? Because instead of being like, okay, these are the consequences and the benefits, it's like, hey, how you live your life right now has some kind of wheat versus weed effect on your afterlife. We don't know what that's like. We're not even the
Yeah.
ones to say like what you're doing is wheat or wheat, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But how you're living right now, and if you choose to follow Jesus and his example, is going to be. I can tell you it's going to be probably a better way to live the here and now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that
That's
gets to a lot of Jesus' metaphors when he talks about seeds that grow and then bear fruit of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other times when he's like, there was a tree that grew and it just didn't bear fruit.
Yeah.
So it wasn't worth keeping. You know, we chopped it down, we threw it in the fire. And again, you know, we'll get to that whole thing. But I think the importance is like the fruit of a tree is what brings it worth in our now existence. Like we can eat and be sustained by fruit of a tree. And like that's the bulk of Jesus' message, is he's saying like, yeah, you need, like, in order to be a thriving part of this human thing, like produce good fruit that people can eat. Like that's the point. And
Mm-hmm.
and what he's saying is, if you don't like, then what's the worth of what you're doing?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And we get caught up on because your thing has no worth, I'm going to chop you down and burn you.
Yeah.
But what he's really saying is like, examine where you are.
Well, dude, that's making me think some heavily metaphorical things. It's like you can either look at yourself as outside of the tree, and you can take from the tree and you can eat it, or you can say this tree is worthless, I'm going to chop this thing down, or
Right.
you can look at yourself as a tree, and as a tree, what is your whole point? It's to bear fruit. It's to feed others.
Mm-hmm.
So like it's kind of comparing the giver/taker mentality, but also like how you perceive yourself in relation to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're getting practical about hell already, which
Yeah.
I think is really, really good. And not
Yeah.
something I necessarily thought would come.
I didn't think we'd get there at all.
I think I think that's great, and I think it's so important as Christians to talk about that with people that aren't Christian. It's not about the consequence, because that's all people hear.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, you just want me to believe because you think I'm going to burn for eternity.
Yeah.
Like
That's not
insane.
the point.
Yeah, no, it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's never what, I mean, Jesus talked about it, but that wasn't how he lived his life.
Yeah, and that wasn't the point of his metaphors when he used those. He's
Right.
like, the point is, I want you now
Mhm.
to be bearing fruit. Bear fruit now,
Mhm.
and like, you know, if you're not, then in the age to come, it's gonna be even worse.
Mhm.
But like right now, it's really bad for you because you're not bearing fruit, and like, you know that because when you choose evil, like, you feel the now consequences
Yes.
of what that evil is.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you bear fruit and if you give to others, it's not only going to be good for others, you yourself are going to feel better.
Yeah,
Right.
your purpose as a tree
In
is
here
valid.
and now.
So we've been talking about like what the point of hell is in the gospel,
Mhm.
I think, which I think is a good thing to talk about. And Jesus presents his gospel more as like a here and now
Mhm.
kind of
Mhm.
thing, like, and we want you to bear fruit now, and if you don't, like, it'll be worse for you in the age to come.
Right.
But it's good for you to bear fruit now because it's good now. But then you get this teaching of Jesus. This is a quote from Jesus in Luke 16, and this is the NIV, which is probably just worth saying. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. So he called him, "Father Abraham, have pity on me, and send Lazarus to dip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire." But Abraham replied, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you is a great chasm that has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us." He answered, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my family, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." "No, Father Abraham," he said, "but if someone from the dead goes to them, then they will repent." He said to them, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." And the context of this does not help at all.
I was going to say,
No.
Back-to-back weird parables.
Yeah, it's just like weird parables, and then all of a sudden Jesus is talking about anyone who marries a woman who's already been married commits adultery, and then just goes straight into this from that.
Yeah.
whoa.
Okay, so now that we've read it again, I kind of get the point of this story. It's to tell people that it doesn't matter what happens to them. If they're not going to believe what's already been set in front of them, they're not going to believe.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think
But
that's like
why?
a point of it.
Well, I mean, I think that's how it, like, that's how I could get some sort of meat out of it, to say this is what I can grab onto from the story. But the way he presents it is so weird.
Yeah.
And like, even if a bit of this is true, it's weird.
Yeah. Well, I think it is worth noting the two places and the names that Jesus chooses
Yeah, I
for
was
the two
gonna
places.
say, yeah.
So you have Abraham's side, also known as Abraham's bosom. Basically, Lazarus, this guy Lazarus goes and he's with Abraham. That's what Jesus is saying.
Right.
This guy goes, he's with Abraham. And
Basically in heaven.
yeah, well,
But not
he's
explicitly
appealing,
heaven.
Yeah, Jesus is appealing to the Jew in
Right.
this point and says like, hey, Abraham is alive in whatever context that matters to you.
Right.
And when this guy died, he goes to be with Abraham. But then he flips to a Roman Greek mythology, at least based on what I'm reading here, and says, now this other guy, when he dies, he goes to Hades, which is like a place that they would know.
Well, Hades is just a Greek word, I think. I don't know if he meant to toss out Greek mythology.
Yeah, I mean,
that could
it's really hard
as,
to say why he would
Yeah.
say that.
Yeah.
It could be like Hayden saying he's appealing to their knowledge of what the Greek idea of hell is.
And wasn't he speaking in Aramaic?
Yeah, but
So this is just a Greek translation of that's what
This could be from the Septuagint, and that's how they translated it. That's a great point. But I mean, I think the picture that he's giving, the reason he would choose this word is because the picture that he's saying. I mean, when the rich man says, he's like, hey, I need just a drop of water to cool my tongue because I'm in agony of fire. Like, Jesus is like appealing to this picture of a really hot, fiery place.
Similar
where
to
this guy
Hades.
is, which their understanding would be Hades.
right. So that happens. But the weird, what I don't like about this passage, well, there's a few things I don't like about it. But in verse 26, when he says, and besides all this, between us and you is a great chasm that has been set in place. So those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us.
Yeah.
So there's a chasm, but there's people still talking to each other on either side, which that kind of destroys everything I think about heaven, because if I can see people tortured in hell, like, I don't think I want to be in heaven.
Well, and you were just like, I don't know if this is real or not. It's like, Jesus freaking said these words.
Well, again, though.
Well, I mean, like real and like literal.
Yeah.
Is this a parable or is this?
Well, I think it seems obviously this is a parable. I mean, he's not talking about. I mean, at least it seems to me he's not talking about a literal event that he like saw happen once. Maybe he is.
That's actually kind of how it struck me.
What I also don't understand though is like if it were just a rich person and a poor person, it would be like, okay, this is a parable, but he gives the poor person a name. Yeah. Like, why?
Lazarus. Well, I actually just Googled. I didn't know if Lazarus meant something special in Greek. It just means the Lord is my help. I thought it was like raised from the dead specific in Greek, but it's not. At the end of it, are the disciples like, what does that one mean, Jesus?
No, he just
goes on to another one? Yeah.
And the next thing he says is, things that cause people to stumble are bound to come, but woe to anyone through whom they come. So I think what you're saying, the meat of this parable and the reason he's saying it is like people have hardened themselves to what is like this rich guy had all the means to feed Lazarus. He didn't.
Right. Mm-hmm.
He was just consumed with himself.
Well,
and
I think it does imply that.
I think it does imply that.
It does imply that he's a bad guy.
It says that he's walking by this guy like on a daily basis, and
Okay.
Lazarus longed to be fed by just the drops of the crumbs of what this
rescued
guy had.
at some point. His life is agony, basically,
Makes me
because
feel
he
like
has
a
dogs
jerk.
licking his sores, and then this other. It's basically reversed.
All I care about helping is my 5 brothers. Like, I don't give a crap about helping everyone else, dude.
It's a big old reversal. And what he's saying is, look, these people, if they're not going to listen to Moses and the prophets, like there's literally nothing I can do is going to tell these people that they should listen to God's way. And I think if you set it in that context, the chasm now makes sense. It's like you have people who are open to listening, and like probably some of the reason they're so open is because they have no other hope to put themselves in this life. Like Lazarus, this guy, he had no hope. All he could hope for is that something better is going to come after this.
Right.
But this other guy, his wealth had created this huge chasm to where there was no way in his mind, even if a dead guy was placed in front of him, would he have been like, nope.
That's the other dope part of that too. It's like he foreshadows his own raising from the dead in that parable.
Yeah. So I think the case can be made for this, that this is a metaphor, and he's using pictures that these people would know to say we're talking about right here and right now. Yeah. However,
in the context of the Bible, where there's like nothing about hell, he gives us this.
Yeah.
It's like, why? And I know there's a reason, and it probably makes a lot of sense to some people, but this is what we have to work with for hell. It bothers me a lot. And there's a lot of other things about, pain and suffering and everything, and he says that, but he didn't have to go into detail, and he did, and that's what I think bothers me.
Well, and I think also the black and white nature of it bothers me. Yeah. We've been talking about there's these different flavors of hell. It could be eternal, it could be temporary, it could be annihilationism, and now this is it's one or the other. Yeah. I think something else that you said too is the dude with his purple linens and stuff like that. He thought that he had reached heaven when he was living on earth. He thought his life was great. Mm-hmm. He didn't focus on bearing fruit. He was focused on his life, his own self on earth, and that's not the point. If you think that you've reached heaven while you're living here.
And you make a great point too. Even after that, all he's worried about is getting some water dropped on him, and then his brothers who are going to be in the same boat. Yeah. Totally me and my tribe sort of mentality.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think it's good. I get the point of it.
But it leads to a lot of misunderstanding.
Yeah. A lot of questions.
Yeah.
I think.
A ton of questions.
Yeah.
And
I get the point of it is to kind of parallel those two things, being in heaven and hell, and having agony on earth, elevating yourself to heaven on earth, and knowing that that's going to have eternal consequences. I think that is good to think about. Because we don't know much about this beggar Lazarus, but we can assume that his life was hell, and that all he had was God. And I think if you get at a point where you don't rely on God for anything on earth, then you're not, you probably don't really have a relationship with God. You're probably ignoring that he even exists because you don't need him.
Yeah. I can relate to that very, very strongly. Because I'm a captain of my own ship kind of a guy. Yeah. It's hard. It is, I have to purposely think to myself, thank you, God, for all the things around me, because it's all from you and it's not from me.
Yeah. And I think, God will give everybody specific ways to give up what they have and follow him. And I think for this man, it was probably his riches, but there have been other rich people in the Bible that had other tribulations and stuff they needed to conquer, like David's a great example. God never told him to give up all of his wealth.
Yeah.
But he had a lot of other things he had to deal with.
Yeah, and you have, at the end, Jesus dies, and you have this rich man, and that's the one distinguishing thing that comes and uses his wealth
and his influence with Pilate
to give Jesus a proper burial. And so it's clear this guy is a disciple, a Jesus follower who
was
is
included in the Bible.
That's probably how you use your earthly blessings.
Yeah. I think that's what the one before it is even talking about, with the shrewd manager. Yeah. It's a weird parable again, because it's a guy that's lying, and then he does one thing that seems to just be helping himself out, but he's being smart with what he has, basically. It's what the Bible says a lot. Be smart with what you're given. Invest what you have. Yeah. Don't hide it.
Well, the word for wisdom, or what is it? The word for crafty. It's used to describe the snake in Genesis, but then it's also used in all of the wisdom parables as
a good thing.
Yeah, a good thing.
The fool squanders his wealth, but the crafty one, diversifies his pocketbooks and things like that. Yeah. So I think why we're bringing this up though is that it gives the traditional picture of hell. Jesus spouts this traditional picture of hell. Now he can be using it as a metaphor.
Yeah.
But if you were just to read that to someone, their response would be the same response that we like are told to give, which is like, I don't want to be that rich guy burning in Hades forever.
Yeah.
And so like passages like this fuel the fire, literally, to use hell as a wielding tool,
Right.
to be gospel driven.
Right.
And so we have done that historically, and I think the question is what is the purpose of that? Does it have a place, and how have we done it, maybe?
Right.
I don't think it has a place. Like, apparently Jesus can do it. I think just like we came upon in our last conversation, like it's not for a denomination or a church or a person to define salvation. I also don't think it's our job or something we can even do correctly to, number one, utilize the idea of hell and eternal torment or whatever
Right.
as like a tool to free people out into following Christ, but also to even like define it. Like we've talked for like an hour about it right now, and like we haven't come upon any sort of definition. We just have like talked about how that would relate to the here and now.
Yeah. And I think thinking too that the worst part of hell and the worst part of all of this is making a decision not to be with God.
Yeah.
Like the punishment, whatever that looks like, comes after that.
Mhm.
But it's that you don't have a relationship with God, and that's the worst part of hell. Like everybody always focuses on the pain, like the physical pain, but you're not really seeing what God is if that's all you're focusing on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Keep going.
Sorry, just to touch back on what we were talking about, I think it's also important to note that Jesus is talking to his disciples, so he's not just saying this to everybody around him.
Right.
He's talking to people that already follow him.
Hmm.
So like that's
I imagine
pretty
him
important.
like standing up on some steps and being like, "Have
Yeah.
I got a story for you?"
Right. So these are people that have already making the choice to follow Jesus,
Gotcha, yeah.
and he's giving them even, my point of view is giving them even harder challenges, saying,
Mhm.
okay, you follow me, but this is what it means to really follow me, and you might end up like a beggar, with swords and stuff, and like that's like the reality of living, following me on earth.
Yeah, and probably giving them some direction to be like, hey, there's some people that like no matter what you do,
Yes.
you're gonna be spinning your wheels like crazy trying to get this person to believe the context of the kingdom, but they're just not going to.
Yeah.
But you know who is going to is these people that need hope in their lives. Like,
Yeah.
they will.
I think
I don't know.
that brings up more questions for me about predestination.
Right, yeah.
Because if God knows there's people that are never going to believe in him, and he made their personality the way that it was, or instructed the life events the way that they happened, did he
harden their hearts?
did he damn those people or not?
Yeah.
Not that we need to talk about that right now, because that's
Yeah.
a huge topic, but I agree. It's to the disciples, it's to the believers. It's saying you're going to encounter people that just aren't going to listen to you.
Yeah, I think part of Jesus' point here too, which we briefly mentioned, is that even in hell, this guy's motivations are still selfish. So Jesus is like, here's the deal. Not only would a dead man rising from the grave not turn this guy, but even throwing him in a
Eternal
lake
torment.
of fire is not getting through to this guy. But yeah, and so your question is like, well, does that mean that this guy was eternally destined for that? And I think that's
Right.
a different conversation.
Or did he? I mean, it doesn't even explicitly say that he's going to be in this place forever.
Well,
Like-
it says that he can't get past the chasm.
Right. Well, he can't move from chasm to chasm, but it doesn't say that he's going to be forever either.
That is true.
I mean, it does go with the traditional view. It's not. You can't speculate on what everything doesn't say because the Bible doesn't say a lot of things.
Right.
But I mean, I think annihilationists would still say, okay, like he's getting his punishment, but that
Right.
doesn't mean he's going to be there forever.
He could burn up into nothingness.
Right.
Totally.
I don't know. Just something to think about.
Yeah, that made my practical application a little cloudier. It's like,
No, I think the practical's still good. I think whatever your point of view is, as a Christian, you should want to be with God for eternity, like regardless of what would happen if you're not with God.
Yeah, and I think the real practical application too is that Jesus' main concern is not for you to be saved, and it's not for you to go around saying I'm saved and you're not, and this is salvation and this isn't, and this is hell and this isn't. But like Jesus' main thing for you is to sow the seed in the context of the weeds and the wheat parable, and to bear the fruit. Like that's the thing. Like
Yep.
so, and like the irony of all these, man, Jesus is so smart. is like how does a tree sow seed? It like creates fruit
Right.
that then things eat, and then it gets seeded out. You know, you know what I mean? Like,
So your bearing fruit doesn't even feed people alone. It also sows some more seed.
Yeah.
Creates more trees to bear fruit.
I had someone tell me this at one point. They asked me, what is the point of a tree? Or what is the point of an apple tree?
Mm-hmm.
And most people would say to make apples.
To eat the apples, yeah.
It's not true. The point of an apple tree is to make more apple trees.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, that's really important to think about, too. Like, the point of our fruit isn't just to bear fruit. It's so that our fruit will go out and create more apple trees.
That's dope.
yeah, and so well, then would I say, hey, you should become an apple tree so that you don't get chopped up and burned
Right.
as
Yeah.
like a non-fruit producing tree. And I think that's where we're getting to this right now, is for some people that's a really compelling thing, and Jesus talked about that all the time, but it seems like almost every time that he talks about it, it's in the context of what you're doing now is important.
Mm-hmm.
Don't you like apple trees? Don't you want there to be more apple trees? That's what you should be caring about.
So is there anything else we want to talk about where we're at now? Do we have a heading for next week?
Oh, well, I feel like so you did bring up predestination.
Yeah.
I do want to talk about that, but I feel like we're going to be spinning the same wheels that we've been spinning for 2 weeks now
Yeah.
to talk about that.
Yeah.
I don't know where else to go, though. Where else would we go?
I mean, predestination, there can be practical application, because I think at the end of all of it, we'll say it doesn't matter what you believe, that you should still live like what you do matters.
That would be the practical application
Right.
of that, I feel like, at the end.
But yeah, it's on the same vein.
Okay.
Because it's all about heaven and hell.
So here, what we've been talking about this whole time, what we've ended up talking about is what you do right here matters, and it has eternal consequences. And I think one question you brought up before is like, why would God make people who have the ability to choose eternal consequence of like sin and death? Maybe where we need to go next is like creation and why we're created
In the first place.
how that happened, and what's our purpose here as humans. Because right now we're talking like eternal perspective, and that is part of our purpose. But it seems from our conversation, what we're saying is the majority of our purpose is the right here, right now. So why were we created right here, right now on this
Are we
earth?
going to get into like evolution?
Sure.
I was gonna say, dude, we
That's
just
where
touched,
it's gonna
we
go,
just touched
probably.
on some some controversial subjects. Like, let's double down.
Yeah.
I think it's a good conversation.
We can talk for a long
We'll just
time
put
about
the
that.
word creation out there.
Yeah.
Call it what it is.
Word.
Okay.
Let's do it.